that. Recording in progress. So welcome back, everybody, to the second seminar in the Essence of History Research Seminar Series. This week, it's my pleasure to introduce Laurence Paul Hemming, who is an honorary professor in the Philosophy, Politics and Religion Department at University of Lancaster, and he is director of the Kant Foundation. He was formerly Dean of Research at Heathrow College, University of London, and he has published a number of books and translations, including Heidegger's Atheism in 2002, Postmodernity's Transcending in 2005, Heidegger and Marx, A Productive Dialogue Over the Language of Humanism in 2013, and he edited and co-translated Ernst Junger's 1932 piece, The Worker, Dominion and Form in 2017. Laurence and I have collaborated extensively over the past few years, developing several projects on Martin Heidegger's relationship with the classics. And inevitably with Heidegger, the question of the philosophy of history comes up again and again. So I'm very excited to hear his paper today, The Essence of History as the History of Essence, the Ground of History as a Difficulty. Over to you, Laurence.
Aaron, thank you very much indeed. I spoke to Aaron this morning and said that every time I began this paper, it turned into a book. Aaron said, you need to write that book, but could you write my paper first, in his usual breezy way. And so this paper is not what I had originally hoped that it might be, because to try and explain what I originally wanted to say proved to be too complicated, I think, both for in the time that I've been given and in this forum. I've compromised and tried to produce what I think is something more like a report, although I hope it works as well as a paper, of what would be preparatory to the book that kept coming out every time I started to write the paper, which I think for the most part will work better than what I had originally envisaged. But what I'm hoping in the discussion is that some of the issues that I really want to touch on would have been able to come out. This is therefore beginning by way of an apology, to say that much has had to be left out and glossed over. What do we ask about when we ask about grounds? What lies as the ground of something is what is most basic. And what is most basic is at the same time what is most prior and first. What then is first, what lies earliest and assumes the greatest priority with respect to our question about history? Here, I do not want to begin as others have begun, by inquiring into the beginning, the first, by naming or searching out the beginning of a rational series, or in Aristotle's case, for instance, the arche or the koinon, from where we set off, as Plato says, chothen, nor the causes in question of what history might be. You perhaps are better aware than I, because it is already visible and has been so for some 200 years now or more, that what we at the same time have come to call history has struggled to establish for itself an adequate ground. And it's that I want to address. This paper will address most of all. It is from here, from this already difficult place, neither at the beginning nor at the end, but in the midst of this difficulty, that the question of ground has already shown up. Does history need a ground? That historians themselves have needed to continue to ask this question is, it seems to me, that which we must address. This is our chothen de, our from any particular place whatsoever, the whence from which we must set off. Not, therefore, is my question about ground even legitimate, but rather that this question appears and continues to appear is its own very why, the why we must address it. Now, my broad and general title is a reference to something that was said by Martin Heidegger when in 1949 he announced in public the existence of what he was to call the sayings of a turning in his slightly revised second published edition of his lecture on the essence of truth. Here, as a saying of a turning, he proposed that the essence of truth, he said, is the truth of essence. Hence my title, The Essence of History as the History of Essence. Much of the contemporary discussion of Heidegger is, as Aaron knows well, I believe made substantially more difficult than it need be on one or both of two counts. Heidegger has far more been studied in English than in German, but he is notoriously difficult to translate. And many translations of his work into English obfuscate rather than clarify what he says. The width and breadth of Heidegger's German can and is often made to sound something more like Dr. Seuss when rendered into English. Second, there has, I think, been sometimes too little willingness among a broad range of Heidegger scholars to relate Heidegger either to his originary sources or to the contexts, and this means the debates within which he spoke. Now, that's not entirely the fault of Heidegger scholars. Heidegger had a tendency to hide his sources, and it's only with the greatest difficulty or the most perspicacious searching that one can find them. The difficulties of, therefore, reading Heidegger are formidable. Few thinkers have read and are as competent in the whole Western canon of philosophical thought as Heidegger is. And yet, not to read as broadly as Heidegger has read, can often lead to shipwreck. Heidegger says that this saying of a turning, the essence of truth is the truth of essence, is an answer. He calls it the answer to the question of truth. As answers go, it's very Heideggerian. It leaves one asking, well, how? How is this an answer? Since the answer is itself at best a riddle. I say this was the first saying of a turning, but this is not really true. One other had already been announced in Heidegger's work, but remained unfulfilled. The first part of the masterwork, Being and Time, was to have been followed, as is well known, by a second, which was to have begun by addressing the theme time and being. This second half, the second half of the saying of a turning from being and time to time and being, was, as is now well known, never published. Let me therefore make my first serious point. Only one philosopher before Heidegger had understood philosophy to be explained through its history, and that was Hegel. Hegel did not invent this history, but rather he addressed in his philosophy of history what he argued had come to the fore as a requirement in thinking itself. And he calls this universal history. It's quite explicit. It's there in the lectures that were published, in fact, shortly after his death on the philosophy, but prepared from his notes by his son, on the philosophy of history. As a universal history, it is therefore, he proposes, history is a history of all that is. It is Hegel and not Heidegger, therefore, who I would suggest first proposes a history of being, a history of all that is. History, philosophy, hitherto philosophy, logic, the practice of reason, is understood to stand apart from history as what can measure history. Hegel turns this on its head. Hegel understands logic in no such way. Rather, he says, is history the actual working out of an eternal logic. It is the expression of the rational substance itself. Now, if Hegel proceeded in this way, no philosopher before Heidegger had understood philosophy to be nothing other than the actual history of which it spoke. Heidegger's history of being, in contrast to what I've suggested is Hegel's, is not the history of everything that is, but almost the reverse. Rather, how, or an inversion of it, how history itself reveals what being is. We begin, therefore, with an actual historical expression of my title. The claim to a history of essence turns out to be the actual occurring and unfolding of the history that is. My paper today is an explanation, a report, therefore, if you like, of why that might be the case. And I've wanted to posit it like this, precisely because I have not wanted to, although my title sounds like a Heideggerian riddle, like Heidegger's own riddles, I've wanted to suggest that they have their ground in actuality, in reality, in the reality of being as it is. This much, there is much, very much, that we will have to gloss over and leave out, at least for today. Now, I'm far from the only student of Heidegger to be speaking in this series. And let me therefore pay tribute to at least one of the others whose title in the series might seem to be at odds with my own, and that is Bob Scharf. It might seem that my title is diametrically opposed to the one announced by Bob, and yet, without any knowledge of what he might say, I have good reason to hope, and I suspect, that it is not diametrically opposed at all. I discovered Heidegger's powerful connections to Wilhelm Dilthey some years ago through lectures Heidegger had given in 1925 at Kassel. They're not very well known. And the need to understand these better led me to Bob's work. The central thesis of Bob's Heidegger becoming phenomenological, interpreting Husserl through Dilthey, I believe to be fundamentally correct. It is impossible to understand even the later Heidegger without understanding what became being and time, as arising on the basis of much of Dilthey's own questioning, and not without a serious attempt to address the issues of life itself, issues that surface in the York-Dilthey correspondence that was published in 1923, and to which Heidegger prepared a considered but excited response within a year of their being published. Now, the other scholar who's paid much attention to this relationship is Charles Bambach, whose Heidegger, Dilthey, and the Crisis of Historicism provides a rich account of the emergence of Heidegger's thought from the 19th century struggles over the issue of history itself. I don't intend to recapitulate either Bob's or Charles Bambach's work today, by the way. I mean, they stand as remarkable edifices in their own right. But I want to acknowledge that is, I would at least hope to, I would hope to be at least to some extent standing in the shadow of what they themselves have achieved in their reading of Heidegger. How then can we begin to consider that difficulty, the difficulty that I've named in my subtitle, and how it might be operative in considering the essence of history? Let us begin with a leading word from Heidegger from Kassel in 1925. Heidegger said at that time, and I quote, "But here, da, where nowadays everyone cares to see Dilthey's limitations, is exactly there where dort, where, according to our understanding, his strength lies. It is not that Dilthey was able to come to a conceptual formulation, rather he restrained himself from a systematic conclusion until the end." And that's what Heidegger said in Kassel. The demand for the essence of history has above all been a demand for the concept, and I mean that in the Hegelian sense. The failure of the concept to be adequate to what is demanded of it should lead us not to the search for a higher or wider or fuller concept, but, Heidegger suggests, to a restraint that Dilthey's own response to Hegel and to the crisis that followed on from him was testament. Restraint in the face of what? What presses in on us? What demand do we face when we seek to account for the essence of history at all? From what, in other words, are we to hold ourselves back? A little more than 20 years ago, some enterprising theologians revisited the issue of St. Thomas Aquinas and the correspondence theory of truth. They came up with what, for them at least, appeared to be a novel formulation. And it ran something like this: if everything in the world that is true first because it is what God knows, and God knows only what is true, because even when God knows what is false, God knows what is false, God knows it's false because God knows it is true that what is false. Then when I know something to be true, even when I know it's true that it's false, I have direct access to what is truly in the mind of God. Now, in fact, this is as entirely orthodox a position in the medieval schools as it is when they restated it 20 years ago. But they then made a second move in which they conflated what in the schools had been carefully separated as the truths of faith and truths about the world. And thus they concluded that, and I quote them, "all thought is a remote anticipation of the final beatified intuition of God." And please note that all thought, not some thought, or thought about God with respect to God's redemptive action, and thought about God with respect to God's creative action. That was the distinction that the medieval schools had preserved. All thought is a remote anticipation of the final beatified intuition of God. Now, I mention them for two reasons. First, and unwittingly, they simply recapitulated Hegel's thought of universal ground as the universal ground of history. It does not matter whether one uses the name of God or absolute Geist for what one names in the concept. For Hegel, the two are one and the same. As soon as we posit a scale within which every thought anticipates and so participates in ultimate and so absolute thinking, we name what Hegel named by God or absolute Geist. It is skepticism towards this claim that is expressed in the very crisis of historicism. And secondly, I name them because the drive for a universal ground persists and in fact constantly reappears in historical thinking ever since Hegel last put down his pen. Hegel resolves the questions of truth, consciousness, and history through inquiring into the relation of history to time. He does this in two principal places. The better known is in his logic, but the resolution here is very brief. It's just a page or two. A fuller and much clearer explanation appears in an earlier text that was never published in his lifetime, but which Heidegger knew well and which had appeared in 1917, edited by George Lassen, the so-called Jena or Jenense logic, the logic that underpinned what then became known as both the encyclopedia logic and then the greater logic itself. Here, Hegel says, time is identical with space. Time as a whole is available across a singular plane, of which every moment is an actual historical instant, but only an instant of the singular universal totality, the plane itself, which has the character of space. It's an extraordinary explanation, by the way, of the nature of time. The singular moment is available only to subjective spirit. In fact, it instantiates subjective spirit in its momentariness and individuated consciousness, but also it instantiates absolute spirit and absolute consciousness, since this contains the whole of history as the singular map of time, map if you like. Eternity, Hegel says at one point, cannot be a time other than now, because then it would itself be a moment in the succession of time. Eternity is therefore negatively present in the now itself, and in fact in every now. You can now see how this works, how every particular now co-represents the eternity that lies within it, within and behind it. The whole of time is therefore taken as what is present to the singularity of consciousness as such, as a singular consciousness, which is why the consciousness in question is something like an absolute consciousness or a divine consciousness. Essential to this understanding is Hegel's concept as negation, as how what has been and what will be are co-present, but they are co-present as the negation of the actual now. In ways that we do not have time to explore, history is therefore collapsed into time, and time is collapsed into consciousness, and consciousness is collapsed into being through the singular unity of the absolute. Truth, Hegel resolves in the same way. Truth is the totality of presence as what is present to the universality of consciousness. Now, the uniting of time and history in this way evacuates both time and history of their relationship to the future, namely that relationship which we understand through the genuine urgency and danger of the unknown, of the unpredictable and the unsuspected, of the irregular, thus of the genuine and dreadful experience of both finitude and the nothing. In other words, one negation, the negation that posits this history as a universal, has the effect of abolishing a different kind of negation. The collapse of the absolute, which manifests itself in a multitude of ways, better known to historians, in fact, than I think many philosophers, also therefore manifests itself as the crisis of historicism. I hope you will forgive me if therefore I take a shortcut in seeking to illustrate how that crisis manifests itself. The thinker who perhaps more than any other in the English language probes and develops the crisis of historicism, someone who is perhaps not read as often as he once was, or is not cited as often as he once was, is Karl Popper. Popper addresses directly the question of the grounds of history as he concludes The Poverty of Historicism. He notes that universal laws in historical thinking are inevitably exposed as trivial and, he says, unconscious. Something else must supersede them. Now, before naming what supersedes them, we must understand by what means Popper arrives at his conclusions. I would want to argue that he arrives at his conclusions with the same relentless, unflinching rigor that Hegel also brings to the positing of the absolute. Not accidentally does Popper name what fails, as in some sense, as the unconscious. For both Hegel and Popper, although with radically different results, consciousness, the I think, which is the unitary and unifying phenomenon of what is present to consciousness, determines and grounds the truth of what it is we can be secure in. Here, it is still that truth is whatever is directly present to, that is correspondent to consciousness. But with regard to historicism, Popper says, the only way out of this difficulty, I believe, is consciously to introduce a preconceived selective point of view into one's history. That is, he concludes, to write that history which interests us. You can see how this therefore works, that whereas for Hegel, history is that which God posits, for individuated consciousness, history is that which we posit for ourselves. Now, we should not hear this as a crude relativism or trivial nihilism. Popper's position arrives with considerable intellectual sophistication and is driven by a formidable array of deliberative practices, the underpinning of established practices, the claims of rigor and scientific method that act as guarantors of what our interest selects. This isn't light, in other words. This isn't the Disneyfication of history, quite the reverse. But we should also understand that this is a statement in utter accord with what we might find in Nietzsche's doctrine of the eternal return of the same. For the doctrine of the eternal return is precisely that means by which the highest values can be posited, because they at the same time are exposed to the threat of the most relentless transvaluation and devaluation. Every value, even the highest, proves to be transitory, which simultaneously reveals it to be historical. It is relative to its time and place, and nevertheless is arbitrary. It is grounded only by an act of choice. Only that highest value can be properly posited, which can secure for itself the highest valuation. Thus, the whole apparatus of evaluation, and this apparatus is above all social, is oriented toward the production and transvaluation of values. Now, we must understand how relentless the activity of devaluation is, and this is, I think, why Popper doesn't survive in much current discourse. In a period of the most radical transvaluation, a period in the West at least, not unlike our own, even the laws of mathematics will be subjected to the most relentless scrutiny for the sake of the transvaluation that demands to be effected. The urgent cry, "Is nothing sacred?" calls forth the riposte, and why should it be? In a period such as ours, I might say, even with my tongue in my cheek, even the death of God might be proclaimed. You can see what I'm trying to suggest here, which is that at one and the same time, the relentless desire to find and proclaim a ground, just as the theologians that I named thought that they'd stumbled across something original, when in fact they were reproducing something that was already well established, is matched by the relentless attack on precisely that move. The crisis of historicism, in other words, is not a singular event, but a continuing unfolding of something else. The question at hand is the ground on which the truth of the true or the historical might stand. which is simultaneously posited as the ground of the I think, and is therefore, it appears, no ground at all. The twin poles of this metaphysics, absolute subjectivity and the absolutization of individual subjectivity, Hegel and Nietzsche, if you like, are standing opposite each other but doing the same thing, reveal that each is constituted by a form of decision, the exercise, one might say, of a deliberative faculty, or the positing of an act of will. Here, one would want to say very much more, but there is not the time. As I explained, this is a shortcut. One thing alone needs to be said. The decision in question, whether it is the actus purus that constitutes at bottom Hegel's constitution of the entire universe as a single act of absolute or divine consciousness, a direct inheritance, we might say, albeit via the Christian baptismal font, of Aristotle's understanding of being as energeia, or the individuated consciousness is self-positing in the face of the relentless unfolding of the historical, because eternal, return of the same, is that consciousness here is a self-positing both as will and as freedom. This is what persists. This is the attainment, if you like, of 19th century metaphysics. Nowhere is this more clearly stated than in the extraordinary statement of Schelling's in radicalizing what he calls the subjective idealism of Fichte. Schelling cites Fichte's claim that activity, life, and freedom alone are the truly real. But he adds to this, and I quote, "All reality, nature itself, the world of things, has activity, life, and freedom at its ground." Or to express it in Fichte's terms, that not only is Ihood, Ichheit is what Schelling calls this, Ihood itself all, but the other way about. Everything is Ihood. Alles Seiende, als Seiendes ist Ichheit, says Schelling. All present being as what is present is Ihood or Einus. Heidegger concluded from Schelling's statement, and that's why I cite it, that the essential doctrine of all German idealism, and here we must include Nietzsche, even though he doesn't fall under the rubric of idealism as such, is that everything that presently is, as being, is Einus. This is in perfect accord with Kant's opening definition of consciousness in his discussion of anthropology. Ichheit, says Kant, Einus, is the ground of the understanding. The ambiguity of the philosophy of subjectivity is precisely uncovered in the ambiguity of the I that here presents itself. It is in this ambiguity that history itself has also been forced to reside, for as long as history is resolved through the I-ness of the conscious and self-conscious I. For Ichheit can never resolve to its own satisfaction, and yet must continue to posit itself as if this problem is resolved, what its ground is. And therefore, whether the resolution of the I is true for this I here, for the I that I am, or for every I, or even for the absolute I, or the divine I. That is to say, for individual or absolute Ichheit or egoity. For philosophy to be genuinely universal must be capable of thinking both the most universal and the most individual together and as an all. I think that's what Schelling, by the way, has in mind by his use of the word all. And yet the all is constantly assailed by its incapacity to be sufficiently encompassing. I'm going to propose that that is, in fact, the crisis of historicism. Within this all, indeed the very theatre of this all, is the being, the very essence of history itself. Understood like this, either as what was named polemically as historicism, or in its dismantling and the exposure of its poverty. In other words, through the positivism that was used to dismantle it, history is grounded in subjective consciousness. We might say that whatever else the 19th century bequeathed to us in the field of history, it bequeathed it in the form history is consciousness. Moreover, it was the very uncovering of the claim of history to universality that there was and is a single unified history, universal history, that prepared for history's downfall and the continuing attempt to recover that universality, almost as if it were a melancholy. It would seem that the essence of history, insofar as there is to be one, cannot free itself from the claims of the consciousness which represents it, and I use that phrase ambiguously, and which it represents. Either the grandiose universal consciousness of the various forms of absolute history, where the claims of religion and the claims of a universalized, globalized humanity become almost impossible to disentangle. I think that's where much of our modern politics lies. Or the claims of more individuated, regionalized consciousnesses. Thus, the histories of specified communities. This is what, if you like, the sorts of things one finds in microhistories or in something like Foucault. Even specified communities become increasingly problematic to define. Indeed, in the end, they too must be constituted by decision, by an act of self-selection or demonstration, in the self-identification is the language we've begun to use, which must necessarily precede an effective historical narrative of regionalized communities. Or finally, they must be constituted as in some sense repressed communities, communities that arise only on the basis of some liberation from having been willed against. We must decide when we undertake a modern history, therefore, or rather we must show how they decided about themselves or came to win their freedom in a process of self-realization, what their history is. In other words, Popper had a point. On this basis, we must decide who was in and who was out. Now, this ambiguity that surrounds the I character or Ichheit of the I manifests itself in a question that Kant himself adds to the three questions he poses in the first critique. These three questions are well known. What can I know? What should I do? What may I hope? But Kant adds to this a fourth, namely, what is the human being? Was ist der Mensch? Kant adds that the first three questions, this is in later work, he adds that the first three questions all refer to the last. What can I know? What should I do? What may I hope? Is summed up in the question, was ist der Mensch? As such, the questions represent the question concerning the anthropological as such. And it's not surprising, therefore, that they turn up in two places, actually. One, this question, was ist der Mensch? One in Kant's lectures on logic, but the other is in his writings on anthropology. This what question, Heidegger also articulates, therefore, as a who question. Who are we? As that question which confronts the human being, both individually and more widely and as a whole. Who are we? Who are we to be? It is here that I want to return to Heidegger's comments about Dilthey at Kassel in 1925. Dilthey, Heidegger says, restrained himself from a systematic conclusion until the end. Why and at what point does a thinker restrain themselves? We restrain ourselves when something that occurs has not yet come fully to presence. But this not yet is of the very essence of all the ambiguities I have identified. Indeed, it is the very basis of both Hegel's and Nietzsche's prioritization of becoming over being. Despite what is so often assumed and asserted, neither Hegel nor Nietzsche abandon or eschew the language of being as such. Hegel's final major work, his recasting of his introduction to his logic, after all, bears the subtitle Die Lehre vom Sein, the doctrine of being. As much is true for Kant. Kant's doctrine that being is not a real predicate means not that being is not a predicate at all, but rather that being alone is that objectivity wherein what is present is posited as coming to be present. Or put another way, being is not the specified predicate of any individual thing, anything actual. It is alone the possibility of the actual. But the possibility of the actual decides nothing as such. Only the possibility of the actual provides for the positing of the actual. It is the undoing of this insight that provides for the only possible ground for history as such, for the presence, the presences. Do we catch a glimpse in Dilthey's restraint of how to think the essence of history? is it that Dilthey's restraint points us not to history as a complete and completed essence, but that history is rather the continuing, as in itself the incomplete? Are we able to find here, therefore, an understanding of history as not that which had happened, but as that which unfolds within happening itself? Certainly in German, at least, there is a strong basis for this. Die Geschichte as geschehen, as happening, and das Geschehnis happening as such. We would need to make these connections for Historia with its origins in Oida, Eidenai, but that perhaps is for another day. I think it can be done, but I don't want to prolong, I don't want to go into an etymological adventure. Schelling's declaration, alles Seiende als Seiende ist Ichheit, all that is present as being is Eines, points both to how Kant had sought to posit the unifying possibility of ground as the subjective act of the positing of the representing subject, Vorstellen. But Heidegger's insistence on the importance of understanding the basis on which this positing came to be explained by Kant is precisely driven by his resolute concern not simply to retreat into the positivism or crude realism into which the 19th century had been driven by the so-called crisis of historicism. The sheer inert materiality of an exterior world as the alternative to the universal presence of the divine mind, namely material presence as such, represents nothing other than the retreat into the will to power over materiality that the caricature of Nietzsche's metaphysics itself also so often posits. But the undoing of this positing as an end, as a finality, and the accomplishment of being as the only possible unifying of what actually is only uncovered at the point when thinking is not understood as the positing, the projecting forth of a ground, but as the accomplishing bringing to presence of what is presencing. Heidegger was unable to accomplish what the initial saying of a turning, the prospect that the analysis of time as such could explain the unifying ground of what occurs, the essencing or unfolding of the human being. This initial attempt failed as the attempt to describe it in terms of time. In remarks he published in 1960, Heidegger remarks on his distress at how already in Being and Time, the relationship between being, das Sein, and human being, das Menschenwesen, had been inadequately thought, having continually to be revisited by him. This failure can be most clearly seen in the 1929 essay Vom Wesen des Gründers on the essence of grounds. But what is it that fails precisely? In a discussion of this form, it is possible only to give a brief report, if only because I want to conclude by touching on the historical consequences of how this failure was overcome. Why was time insufficient? Why was it not possible to move from being and time to time and being? Because even though Heidegger had successfully and decisively attacked the Aristotelian notion of time as the succession of nows, as the counting of time within the soul, namely what was to become the subjectivity of the subject, if you like, and because therefore he had argued that time was an indivisible and a continuum, just as being itself is an indivisible and a continuum, a synechès. Nevertheless, time is experienced discontinuously. Indeed, the actual practice of history demonstrates this. We speak, for instance, of historic times, of Roman Britain or the Inca Empire, of times and periods and epochs and so forth, of the various distributions of the possibilities of time. It's not possible to write a history without the distribution of the possibilities of time. Each, however, represents the genuine point of what had at one time been a present time. The analysis of time alone could therefore not provide a sufficient ground for history, just as the positing of the I alone cannot accomplish this ground. Ichheit cannot accomplish a sufficient ground for history. Yet at the same time, the demand for an account of the philosophy, of the history of the philosophy of history, had brought to the fore the search for the beginning of philosophy. This beginning had, to some extent, already been named in Plato and Aristotle as those who succeeded the poets, and this seemed for a long time as a kind of deliberation that was satisfactory in its own right. But three more original thinkers appeared in this quest for the beginning as such. Those three were Anaximander, Parmenides, and Heraclitus. All three were names known throughout the whole history of philosophy. At the same time, what was known of them was fragmentary and contested and difficult to discern. For the longest time, Plato's report of Parmenides especially, and the concomitant, often garbled, sometimes even tongue-in-cheek reports of Diogenes Laertius, of Theophrastus and others, were thought sufficient to account for what remained of them. This is true for Parmenides especially. It was long thought that Plato's dialogue, the Parmenides, gave an effective account both of Parmenides and Zeno. It was Hegel who was the first to attempt any systematic analysis of either Parmenides and his disciple Zeno or Heraclitus. Hegel goes so far as to say at one point that every word of his logic was shaped and influenced by the fragments of Heraclitus. The 19th century as a whole, beginning with Christian Brandes and culminating with Hermann Diels and Karl Reinhardt, inaugurated the long-awaited return of any reflection on the remains of these three thinkers. Now, because this paper is more in the form of a report than a systematic presentation, it is possible in the time left to me really only to present the results in the barest way of the inquiry into the beginning that these three originary thinkers represent. They encompass some of Heidegger's most daring and remarkable interpretations of ancient texts, but most fundamentally, they address both the accomplishment and ambiguities left behind by the pinnacle of thinking that Hegel himself represented, and the questions, therefore, that he left in their wake. This reading begins in earnest for Heidegger with his first full systematic reading of the fragments of Parmenides and the two extant fragments of Anaximander. In fact, one is a fragment and the other is a mere report, in lectures that were made available to the public domain only in 1912. They were given in 1932. They proceed through further periods of Heidegger's investigations into these three, proceed through further periods of exegesis in the early 1940s. All of them now published, but one was never delivered in public, but for which the preparatory material exists. And then they culminate in a series of shorter published works and fragmentary references in other material throughout the 1950s. Heidegger's investigations of these three thinkers address fundamentally the question of the relation of the occurrence of the human being, das Menschenwesen, in relation to Dasein, being itself. Exactly the issue that had distressed him, he had said, as an unfinished question in Being and Time. And in concluding, there is really only one point that I wish to make with respect to my title, and that is that history is itself a being. As a being, it is also in each case a time, and as a time, it is in each case a disclosure, what it is to be true, aletheia, if you like. History in this case means in each case a presence from out of a particular present. We may unify these as in each case, therefore, by the name as in each case, a place. Now, as a being, history as a being, I do not mean as an object, which is the ordinary way in which we hear the word being. History, strictly speaking, is, as a happening, also that happening which provides the ground for the happening that we are at the same time. That is, in fact, what I think Schelling means by all is Ichheit. Both each of us individually and entire, the all within the happening as it happens, is unified by its being a being. It is the incompleteness of this happening, which is both a ground and a non-ground, in Heidegger's German, an Abgrund, an abyss. It is for this reason that Heidegger says that the ground of anything at all, of the ground of being itself, is abyssal. He also says, in ways that we can perhaps touch on, that Kant himself had stared into this abyss and shrunk back. A being is that where particular things happen and can appear for a while and can pass away into disappearance. A being is therefore that happening wherein the I, but not as a subject, although definitely as a self, can come to be. Here, the unity of the I is accomplished, but the unity of the I is accomplished within the whole of the being in question, and therefore its ambiguity is overcome, not by some postulation, not by the presumption of the same positing in each case, but rather by the unifying gathering that brings the unity of what already is together as a being, as a presence, as the known. This, Heidegger argued, was what Heraclitus had meant by logos, the unifying gathering. However, every particular being, every particular happening, every particular coming to presence as coming to be and passing away, every particular time, therefore, as a place, is at the same time even more originarily unified by the continued unifying of what singularly lets being be present. I'm asking the question, albeit, and I apologize for the Dr. Seuss language, of what lets the different epochs of history be. The occurring, the essencing of presences, of in each case a being as a unifying being present to whatever is, what I have suggested in each case is history as happening, is itself never present. It is in this sense being as nothing, as what lets history, presence, as presences happen. The history that happens, the essence is the essencing of history, is that history that unfolds from being as such, the history of essence, as the history that being unfolds. But this comes to be known only from the history that this being has and is, which is itself the history of essence. I hope, therefore, albeit even slightly tongue-in-cheek, I have got away with my saying overturning the essence of history as the history of essence, the ground of history as a difficulty. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurence. That was tremendously interesting, giving us an awful lot to chew on. And in the spirit of chewing, then I'll open the floor to discussion. George.
That was just clapping. That was not a hand.
Oh, sorry. I'm still getting used to this Zoom. Has anyone got any questions or discussion?
There a hand raising function here?
There is, yeah. Luke and then David then.
Okay, so thank you, Laurence. This provokes, I suppose, several thoughts that you're really interested in trying to characterize the nature of the historical process, not what Heidegger in Being and Time calls historiology, i.e. historical epistemology of the sort that would give us an account of historical knowledge in the analytical sense of that term. I guess that's the impression I'm getting from you. But you do say, you know, historians keep asking this question of the ground of history, and you know, I wonder who you have in mind, because it doesn't seem to me that actually any of these metaphysical issues, even if they're in some way presupposed in historical analysis, actually have much bearing for most professional historians on what they get up to. I mean, some historians write histories of time, for example, so, you know, that, or histories of our ideas of the concept of time. People write, John Burroughs written a good book on the sort of crisis of reason in the 19th century, where he talked about the crisis of historicism and so on. But for these purposes, you're not, as a historian, trying to sort of decide whether, I suppose, the crisis of historicism is something that still affects us in a contemporary context. You're just trying to understand why people thought there was one. Whether there actually was one or not is sort of a separate question for the historian. You're not, as it were, committing yourself one way or the other in writing a history of the crisis of historicism. So I guess that those are the first 2 points. Are we talking about history as a, you know, some kind of process? How, if at all, does this actually relate to what historians do? And finally, I guess specifically, I think, pick you up on, in particular, your reading of Hegel, perhaps as mediated by Heidegger. I mean, Heidegger's interpretations of the history of philosophy are often interesting, but as you know, generally contentious. I mean, he retracted on the Kant book somewhat, which he wrote after being in time. His etymology for Dilthey, in the end, he was forced to sort of admit wasn't quite right. And when it comes to Hegel, you talk about Hegel as sort of being the culmination of the historicist tradition, and the failure to sustain it was what leads to the crisis of historicism. But there's an alternative reading of Hegel. People like Zizek and Carlson and so on argue this, that Hegel is actually trying to invert the traditional view that people like Plato are putting forward. And Hegel's whole point about essence in the logic is that the essence of essence is that there is no essence. And if you read what he says about the nature of the absolute idea in the phenomenology, Hegel's point about the end of history is there is no there. Once you sort of you've been through the process, you realize that well, now we're just kind of stuck. I mean, things are going to carry on happening, but you know, once, as it were, universal freedom has been achieved, at least in principle, we've realized everybody's sort of an individual subjectivity and so on. Well, there's a certain kind of completion to history, but unlike Hegel, unlike Marx or Kant, Hegel is not predictive about what's coming next. You know, Hegel thinks we've kind of, something's done, but that's it. Now we're just kind of left to our own devices, as it were. And you know, this is not some kind of grand progression towards a final beatitude, or insofar as there is such a progression, it's all over. That's as good as you're going to get, and now we just have to cope with, you know, how to get on with life. So there's a very, as it were, deflationary and skeptical account of Hegel as a kind of ironist, which has become much more influential in recent years, and which implies that the 19th century and Heidegger profoundly misunderstood him, that they didn't get what Hegel was saying at all. And so I guess I would like, as a third point, to pick you up on that. That's probably enough. I'll save the rest.
Luke, thanks very much indeed. I mean, just on the aletheia point, I mean, that really arises on the basis of Paul Friedlander's 1954 attack on Hegel's etymology of aletheia. I just remind you that Friedlander had to retract and rewrite the entire chapter there. So I think that but that's not the main issue that you've raised, and there's a great deal, in fact, that you have. I think you're absolutely, just on Hegel, you're absolutely right that there is a more skeptical, or rather a more ironic Hegel. It's not clear to me that Hegel intends to reach, as it were, an overarching systematic conclusion. In fact, Hegel cuts us off quite often, especially around the notion of death. He simply, I mean, he almost writes death off. What I'm interested in, there was, in the longer version of this paper, which I had to cut a lot out because it just kept flowing in. It was irritating. Normally I struggle to write. This time it just kept flowing, and I had to leave a lot out. It was an apology for not, because I am not a historian. I wouldn't claim to be, but I am fascinated by what historians are doing, and I'm fascinated especially by the extent to which many of the controversies in contemporary life are perceived as historical controversies. That is, they're perceived as competing interpretations over the character of history. Now, in my discussion with some historians, I've discovered that historians are particularly neuralgic to discussing the metaphysics of that. And yet, my own view is that it's impossible to understand those controversies without at least addressing those metaphysical questions. But I agree with you. Historians have been very reluctant to do so. And in fact, one particular historian who I began to talk about almost ran screaming from the room. He's very eminent as well. It rather amused me that he just said, you know, we're not interested in questions like this. I don't, my only point would be that if historians are not interested in them, people who are interested in what historians are interested in these questions. And although Heidegger pushes the question of historiography to one side, it's often forgotten that Heidegger's first lecture was actually on the character of historiography. It was his trial lecture. For once he'd been granted the habilitation, he had to give a trial lecture for his habilitation dissertation. And it's on the question of whether it's possible to have a social scientific definition of time. And it's a very, very effective 19th century attempt to produce, as it were, an average understanding of time, which he then, I think, spends much of his time unpicking. What I wanted to illustrate in responding to you, what I wanted to illustrate in the way that the paper worked was that those of us who watch what historians do, watch, as it were, a process where an attempt to assert a unified understanding of history is posited, which is then pulled apart, and why that would be the case. That's, I think, as a philosopher, interests me. I don't, in one sense, have an answer to whether history has a unified ground. In fact, I don't think unified grounds are even possible. But nevertheless, we continue to ask about them. And so it was that I was trying to address. And it's that I think Heidegger himself is trying to address. It's why he refuses to get into, as it were, the historiographical or the historiological aspects of what he's doing in Being and Time. But I don't think that one can simply push Hegel aside as an ironist. I've spent a long time in the different drafts of his lectures on the philosophy of history. They are bombastic. I mean, you're absolutely right. He was absolutely confident that Prussia in somewhere between 1819 and 1831, when he stopped giving those lectures, I think that he gave them in cycles of every 2 years, was about the best possible place to be. Now, something of that is replicated by two very important thinkers in the modern discourse. One of those is Alexandre Kojève, and the other is Francis Fukuyama. I mean, Fukuyama's appeal to Hegel in The End of History is not accidental, and I think it is actually a very interesting one. I haven't read Fukuyama's latest book, and it's being reviewed as a sort of a stepping back from his initial Hegelian pretensions. But in fact, I don't find Fukuyama stepping back. I mean, he is continuing to assert that something like liberalism is an end point. We've arrived. And that is a direct inheritance, I think, of Kojève's version of Hegel and actually of Hegel's version of Hegel. I find that difficult, to be absolutely honest. I struggle with that notion of that we've arrived, and yet it would be very, very hard to step aside from the view that that's what Hegel really thought. And that's, I don't have a better answer for you than that without going into a great deal more detail about, as it were, what I had to leave out, which I don't particularly want to do. But I don't think that one can sidestep this, that history as it's being told, even though historians are not thinking metaphysically, historians continue to assert crests of waves, which then get pulled apart. I mean, I think that's somewhat Popper's point. And that seems to me to be an uncomfortable way to carry history out as a non-historian. But maybe that's all historians need. I don't know. I mean, in other words, I'm turning the question back on you as best I can, because I don't think it's good enough. I have found myself unsatisfied with the historians who've said, well, you know, in sometimes in quite sort of, you know, in the masterful tones of Cambridge professors, as it were, that, well, that's not what we really do. And so therefore don't try and make us. Well, that's not good enough, because Hegel's, the opening section to Hegel's philosophy of history does assert the things that Heidegger claims it does. There's no irony there. And Heidegger takes that seriously, and I think he's right to do so.
Thank you. I'm going to let someone else. I'll get back to you.
Yeah, please.
But please,
David,
people have questions.
Yes, well, thank you very much for this paper, which accomplishes a lot, not the least of which is to bring Hegel and Popper together. I think that's a reunion that neither of them would have welcomed, but it may be, if Hegel's an ironist, maybe that would be the supreme irony. But there's a problem with that, and I do want to bring it up. When Popper published this book, most people pointed out that he was not using historicism in anything like the standard sense, the one that was addressed by all those people talking about the crisis of historicism. For Popper, historicism simply meant historical determinism, and it meant Hegel and Marx in his reading of Hegel and Marx. So to link him, as you try to do, with the notion of the crisis of historicism, I think is a bit wrong-headed. What the crisis, you know, Troeltsch and Husserl and other people who were attacking historicism were worried about wasn't determinism, it was relativism, and it's just the opposite of what Popper was on about. Historicism for them was relativism in which everything collapsed into history and there's nothing left. So that's one problem I had. The other has to do with this notion of ground. And I was glad to see that in your response to the last question, you somewhat retreated from that notion. I thought that was the whole point. What's the ground of history? And I never really thought that it needed one. In fact, I'm not sure that anything needs a ground. It's kind of a metaphor that I think whose days are over. But with respect to Dilthey, you know, Heidegger's reading of Dilthey, as you had it, had to do with Dilthey's restraint. That was your term, I think. Maybe that's Heidegger's term too, I don't know. Dilthey's restraint in not arriving at some systematic conclusion. Well, I don't think Dilthey ever wanted systematic conclusion. Dilthey was not a systematic thinker. He was that, you know, that's how he differed from Hegel among others. And so I certainly wouldn't call it restraint. I mean, this is why Dilthey was one of those historicists that was attacked by the crisis of historicism people. So just a couple of comments.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, you will recognize in my comments about Popper that he's a good old-fashioned straw man, except for the quote, because it seems to me that the quote opens Popper to the most radical accusation of precisely the relativism that he was opposed to. And that's what intrigued me about it. It's right at the end, where he says that we end up by doing the history in which we have an interest. Now, he casts that very careful. He doesn't say doing the history that we're interested in. It's not mere relativism, and that's why I tried to qualify it, but doing the history in which we have an interest. But my question is, again, and this is why I turned the question somewhat back at Luke as well, why is that not a relativism? In other words, if you retreat from the kind of posited ground that Hegel offers, why do you not collapse into relativism? And that is the problem of the 19th century. Now, I take entirely your point that Popper's definition of historicism is somewhat sharper and slightly different. But that is exactly the struggle that it seems to me that the 19th century German historians had, is how they avoided, as it were, a crisis of relativism. And they did that precisely by the retreat into the methods that Popper himself proposes, which are the methods of, let's say, prudence of analysis, of prudence with respect to archives. All of those things depend necessarily, therefore, however, on a ground, and that is the ground of truth. Because if history doesn't have a ground of truth, it's not clear to me what it is that historians think that they're doing at all. And that, it does seem to me, is the question that Heidegger is attempting to address. That, as it were, even if one takes the view of those historians that I've been talking to recently, or who've been reluctant to talk to me recently, I mean, I'm using that as a trope, nevertheless, they have a very, very strong sense of the truth of what they're doing, and of the way in which the truth of what they are doing is either being distorted and overlooked. And I'd like to broaden that out. I mean, I've forgotten the name there's a film I nearly went to see. It was a bank holiday here, a public holiday yesterday in England, and this is on at my local cinema. It's Norseman, I think it's called. And I read a review of it recently, and the review was at great pains to stress how much effort had been taken with the historical accuracy of everything, of all the artifacts in it. In other words, this isn't simply the concern of academic historians. The question of the ground of truth also presents itself even in the massification of history. For instance, in the debates around the presence of, let's say, the presence of non-white characters in historical situations. I mean, I'm thinking of other historical. Bridgerton would be another example. These questions cannot be evaded unless one simply wants to, because without that question of ground being addressed, then history does simply become exactly as Hegel proposed it, but without the notion of the absolute to underpin it, which is just a resource. I mean, by that extraordinary statement in the Inenso logic that time is nothing other than space, it simply becomes a set of drawers from which one may pluck out artifacts arbitrarily and make collages, which falsify the record in the most extraordinary ways. And yet we are concerned with the truth of the record. So, I mean, you make a robust, you push back robustly, as it were, on one or two of the issues, but it does seem to me that there is a problem with the exact statement that I quoted from Popper, which is that history is nothing other than that which we have within our interest, as it were. Why is that not simply a decisionism? Now, I don't think Popper meant it as a decisionism, but nevertheless, it's difficult even within the terms within which he writes it. I mean, I'm trying to be careful towards him at the same time. He's not just a straw man. It's difficult to find, therefore, that I interpret that as the way in which the concern for grounds represents itself and why it achieves no resolution. And yet, I'm not sure that I'm not sure that we want to end up where Hegel ends up, with a simple and unitary understanding of history. In fact, we know that that's not where we want to end up, because we know how shocking some of Hegel's statements are. I mean, some of his observations, for instance, on ethnology are really quite crude and dangerous, in fact. And now that I'm not of the view that Hegel should be persecuted for that. I mean, a man who made, as far as I can tell, only one trip out of Schwabia in his life, apart from to go to Berlin, and that was into Alsatian France, was not in any sense well traveled. But nevertheless, we have to address these questions of grounds, it seems to me. We can't get away, we can't evade them. I would suggest.
Does anyone else have any more questions, or should we return to Luke?
I really don't want to hog it. If anyone else wants
No,
to.
Yeah, if anyone wants to.
I mean, just on the Dilthey question, I mean, I'm you know, Bob Scharf is looking at me earnestly here, and I can see that, and I don't want to intrude on the ground that he's far more expert in than me. I mean, I find, in as much as Heidegger does read Dilthey, and one has to read between the lines, in fact, to establish Heidegger's reading of Dilthey, but I think Heidegger's reading of Dilthey is very sensitive, in fact. I mean, I think there is, the quote about restraint is actually from Heidegger. It's from Kassel in 1925, when he is reading Heidegger. In fact, when I gave some lectures on those lectures, and there was one particular text of Dilthey that it looked to me as if Heidegger had read, but it had not been published at the time. But in fact, Heidegger had somebody had a private copy of the manuscript, somebody that Heidegger knew well. Bob's nodding, so it looks like my sleuthing at that time was correct. But for instance, Dilthey is the first person to hyphenate the word Dasein. He doesn't hyphenate it just as Dasein, he hyphenates it as Da-sich-sein in several manuscripts that Heidegger had access to. And that's what I mean by Heidegger being a sensitive reader of Dilthey. What I see in Heidegger is somebody who is wanting to respect the collapse in the essence of, in the unitary, universal history that Hegel is proposing. Heidegger is not somebody who is trying to glue this back together, but he is also aware of the dangers of refusing to accord history a ground at all. And that's what my paper most of all was trying to address. Because if you simply say, well, history doesn't need a ground, you actually concede everything to relativism. And yet there are other people who are not conceding everything to relativism, who are doing interesting things, even in mass culture. And I think that is worthy of attention. In other words, if the historian simply throws her hands up and says, well, it doesn't matter to me, you know, you make it up as you want, she or he is not doing what the rest of us are doing with respect to history. We care, I think. And so I'm worried when a historian says to me, well, do we need a ground? Because I want to say to you, yes, you do. And at least I might be willing to discuss with you where that ground might come from, but I hope you might be willing to discuss it with me. In other words, I'm kind of saying I was disappointed when those historians ran screaming from the room.
David Palawa.
I'm not sure I have a specific question, but I have some worries I'd like to hear more about. Points in your paper that intrigued me. Maybe some ambiguities. First of all, I'm concerned that we're collapsing the distinction between origin and beginning. And when it comes to history, the paradox is the Heideggerian Hegelian thing tends to identify history and time. And historians, though, tend to tell me they study the past. They don't study time. And so we have to take them seriously on that. But the second point would be then that when we collapse the distinction between history and time, I think what we're appealing to is a collapse between we live in history, we live in time. And we're putting those two together and trying to think from there. But the paradox is, with beginnings, we've already begun. I'm a Ricourian, if you don't know me. We're never at the origin. I would say it would be my starting point. And the interesting question in talking to historians is, how do you begin? And you raise that at the problem of, is that simply a decision? And I'm wondering, having said all this, if it comes to how do we recognize that we've already begun as a way of saying we live in history? Can you run with that in a little bit and help me?
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, I think that's why I was careful at the beginning of my paper to make clear where I was beginning from, which was the present, as it were. That is to say, that is to say that the Aristotelian appeal to original causes, or to it seems to me not to work here. And I'm frankly horrified by, to some extent, by Hegel's collapse of history and time into one. I was coming close in working through this paper. I haven't. I mean, let me own up. As far as I can tell, I mean, there are others here who might have the answer to this, but as far as I can tell, Martin Heidegger never once defines the word Geschichte. I can't remember. I'm looking at Bob, but he's not giving any indication either. But I can't think of anywhere where he says this is what history means. Now, he's not given to this is what statements in any case, and that would be an important caveat to make. But history, it seems to me, if it's to mean anything at all, and that's why I defined it as a being, but not a being in the sense of an objectivity, but rather a being in the sense of a unity of presence, makes perfect sense. Because initially one wants to say, well, the present will do for that. But there are many presents, as it were, and it seems to me that's exactly why the shift from being and time to time and being failed. Because what looked like the unifying possibility for as ground, and this is why I think the 1929 essay on Heidegger's own terms fails, but it's possible to see, rereading it, how it fails. It fails exactly to unify the general, the generalized I with the individual I, as it were, exactly on the terms that I think fails in German idealism. What therefore gathers together the different presence, both for us now and in the sense that we are well aware that they have presence then. Now, that would be quite a complicated thing to do in one sense, but in another sense, it's not that complicated. It needs to be because that is what, as it were, we know. And that's the Diltheyan sense in Heidegger that I perceive. He speaks from out of life itself. In other words, not from a scientific analysis of this, but rather from what we just know from the passage of our own lives. And so I think I was trying, although perhaps rather clumsily, to hold history and time apart rather than allow them to collapse into each other. So I think that would be my first answer to you. Can you just remind me what your second question was? I thought I'd written it down, but I haven't written it down here, and I apologize.
Is this question of you raised of how to begin.
Yes, yeah.
And whether beginnings, and let's talk about how does the historian begin. And when I look at the history of history, which is fascinating, I see those histories written, historians write with a purpose. That's one answer. Another, Raymond Aron, they start with a question. And I don't know what else I could put on that list, but I've been puzzling over that distinction between history is written for a purpose or history is written in order to answer a question, and then thinking what is the question they're working with.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you. I mean, there are two things that I'd want to say there. One is there's a reason why I raised the question of the reading of Anaximander, Heraclitus, and Parmenides, because that's exactly the work that Aaron and I have been doing over the last 5 months, is working through with a group of people the first set of lectures from 1932 on that, and the reading there has been astonishing to me. It's quite unlike what I'd expected. I thought that I knew Heidegger, I understood Heidegger's reading of Parmenides, but the 1932 lectures are quite unlike the set of lectures that are far better known that he gave in 1942. But what really intrigues me about that is the way in which he brings a record from the past to bear on the present. And it seems to me that that is, above all, what the historian needs to do. And in fact, that's what Heidegger himself says in lectures that he gave on logic immediately after resigning from the rectorate in 1934. He says history concerns, above all, the present. I mean, it's an attack on Hegel, actually. It's a long and complicated attack on Hegel, intended as a provocation, I think, to the people that had forced him to resign as rector of Freiburg University. But we begin, I think, for ourselves from where we are. I don't think there's any other way to begin, and that if we don't begin in that way, as it were, the beginning is always artificial. We've introduced something into that beginning that as it were, doesn't really belong there. But it's that reading of Parmenides and Heraclitus, and I mean, the reading of Anaximander is actually quite extraordinary in my view, throws relief. I mean, it's why I think that the project of the destruction of the history of philosophy is abandoned, because Heidegger realized that this isn't so much a process of destruction as of a reaching back beyond and a bit back behind and into that which throws relief on the present. And that, it seems to me, is the most important thing that history does for us. It actually shows us, it shows us up in the depth that we are. I mean, that's the most important thing of all, that the historian is called to do, to show that our most immediate assumptions about the way that life is have been thought in an entirely different way. And I mean, I'm putting that very flatly, but simply as simply because that's what I find in the reading of especially Parmenides that Heidegger undertakes in those lectures. It throws absolute relief and enables him to provide an answer which was already lying there, which replaces the answer that he was struggling to piece together as a kind of a scientific rational answer, if you like, about the question of being. And that for me is intriguing. I mean, that represents then the entire. Peter Travny says in the conclusion of those lectures that this represents the very beginning of the fundamental shift in Heidegger's emphasis towards what then eventually becomes the notion of, for those of us who are obsessed about these things, das Ereignis in Heidegger's thinking. But it has its origin in that lecture course. I think that Travny is probably right about that. He edited the texts for publication. But the beginning, therefore, has to be where we are. It has to be from where we set off, as it were, rather than an artificial beginning, which is posited rationally, as it were. It has to be from the, in a Diltheyan sense, from the midst of life itself, the life that we actually are and have. I hope that answers your questions. Thank you.
Sorry, Luke, I think we've run out of time now. If we could just thank Laurence again for his fascinating paper and quite an in-depth discussion.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody for coming. We'll see you again next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.